From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
First in our lineup of great authors today is Douglas Waller, a veteran magazine correspondent and the author of numerous books about the American military as well as American intelligence operations. In almost 2 decades as a Washington journalist, Doug Waller has covered the Pentagon, Congress, the State Department, the White House, and the CIA. From 1994 to 2007, he served in Time magazine's Washington Bureau, first as a correspondent, then as a senior correspondent. He has also served as diplomatic correspondent, traveling throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, as well as the Persian Gulf, in pursuit of stories. He has carried out extensive coverage of the Middle East, peace negotiations, and the wars in Iraq. Before coming to Time magazine, Doug was a correspondent for Newsweek, reporting on major military conflicts from the Gulf War to Somalia to Haiti. He was born in Norfolk, Virginia, studied at Wake Forest University, and did graduate work in urban affairs at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Before joining Newsweek in 1988, he served as a legislative assistant on the staffs of Senator William Proxmire and Representative Edward Markey. Douglas Waller is now a defense analyst for Bloomberg Government. Among Waller's many, many books, a number of them bestsellers, are The Commandos, The Inside Story of America's Secret Soldiers, Air Warriors, The Inside Story of the Making of a Navy Pilot, and Big Red, The Three-Month Voyage of a Trident Nuclear Submarine. Waller's new book is a biography of an outsized American character, General William Wild Bill Donovan, the founder and director of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the modern CIA. In this superb biography, at once a cliffhanger and a work of deep scholarship, Doug Waller tells the story of a man who built a far-flung intelligence organization out of absolutely nothing in the middle of one of the most brutal wars of our time. An ambitious young lawyer with political aspirations, William Donovan had written to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942 and told him that what the country really needed as it hunkered down for war was a good spy operation. Roosevelt, desperate for information, gave him the task. Donovan was fearless, even reckless, always itching to be in the center of attention, and the story Waller tells is full of action on the ground and in the corridors of power. As David Wise, who has written extensively about the CIA, wrote on the pages of the Washington Post, Wild Bill Donovan, name of the book, is the first carefully researched, in-depth biography of the legendary World War II Spymaster. For anyone interested in the history of American intelligence, it is required reading. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a terrific writer and journalist, Douglas Waller. I'm sorry, before I bring him on, welcome. I'm sorry, before I actually give him the microphone, I must say, we expect you to ask questions after he speaks, but I must warn you that your image, if you come to the microphone, which we hope you will do, will be filmed and then buried in the tombs of the Library of Congress forever. So be careful.
Thanks, Marie. It's great to be here. Actually, we're sitting in a very appropriate spot for a discussion about Wild Bill Donovan, because just a few blocks from here is where his spy agency had its headquarters. It was up on Navy Hill, right next to the State Department. His staff called it the Kremlin, his headquarters. It was had been an abandoned public health service building. In fact, they'd been doing syphilis research there. And when Donovan's men moved into the headquarters, there were still animals in cages up on the top floor that they hadn't carted out. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, had a lot of fun with that little morsel. In fact, he sent out propaganda broadcasts that Donovan's new home was for 50 professors, 10 goats, 12 guinea pigs, and a sheep, which actually wasn't far from the truth. Wild Bill Donovan really is 3 stories in one. It's a very compelling biography of a truly heroic figure who met a lot of tragedy in his life. It's also a spy story, an exciting spy story about World War II, and it's a story about political intrigue at the highest levels of Washington, which is the part that really intrigued me the most because I'm a journalist. I've said in some talks that I would have loved to have been a reporter covering Wild Bill Donovan back then in the 40s, and I probably would have. Donovan liked reporters. He liked leaking to the press. He had reporters on his staff as propagandists and spies, and before he headed up the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, he would go out overseas on missions for the government or for his own private industry, posing as a correspondent and filing to different news agencies. He wasn't a particularly tall man. He was only about 5'9". One of his agents, Betty McIntosh, thought that when he ran the OSS, he kind of looked penguin-shaped. In fact, she told him that one time. He didn't really appreciate it. One of his other operatives, Mary Bancroft, said he looked like a Cupid doll. Now, don't anybody ask me what a Cupid doll looks like, but that's what Donovan looked like then. He slept 5 hours a night, could speed read at least 3 books a week. He was an excellent ballroom dancer. He loved to sing Irish songs. In fact, he would go to Broadway and pick up the latest sheet music so he could learn the latest musical tunes. He didn't smoke, he rarely drank, he enjoyed fine dining, which added to the weight. He spent lavishly, he had no concept for a dollar. In fact, when he was overseas visiting stations, which where he was most of the time, an aide would always be with him with a bunch of quarters and dollar bills because Donovan was always mooching them off of him. He was witty, but he never showed or never told a dirty joke, never laughed out loud, never showed anger too. Instead, he let it boil up inside of him. He was rakishly handsome, particularly as a young man. He had bright blue eyes that women found absolutely captivating. His life, however, had a lot of tragic aspects to it. His daughter died in college in an automobile accident. His daughter-in-law died of a drug overdose. And one of his granddaughters at 4 years old died when she accidentally swallowed silver polish. He was born on New Year's Day, 1883, in Buffalo's poor Irish First Ward. In fact, I gave a book talk in Buffalo during this and discovered that all this time I had been saying Donovan's name wrong. I mean, if you're from Buffalo's Irish First Ward, you pronounce it Donovan, not Donovan like I was saying. Of course, it screwed me up for the rest of the book talk. He thought he might be a priest. In every Irish Catholic family, it was always assumed that one of the sons would become a priest. Donovan realized he really wasn't cut out to be a man of the cloth, so he went to Columbia University, was a star quarterback his senior year, until a cheap tackle from a Princeton lineman hobbled him for the rest of the season. He attended Columbia Law School after Columbia University. Franklin Roosevelt was a law student with him. In fact, Roosevelt liked to say that he and Donovan were old pals in law school, and Donovan said that was a bunch of baloney. Roosevelt had nothing to do with somebody as low a social strata as Donovan was. He returned to Buffalo, set up a very lucrative law practice, married one of the wealthiest women in Buffalo. Then World War I comes. He goes off to war. He commands a battalion in the famous 69th Irish Regiment, a very famous New York regiment. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor during World War I for some very heroic action. His priest in the 69th Regiment, Father Francis Duffy, said Donovan was one of the few men he'd ever met who actually enjoyed combat. And he really did. He would write to his wife, Ruth, that going out on combat was like going out trick-or-treating at night. That in World War I was where he earned the nickname Wild Bill. He was actually a very rigorous and brutal trainer of his men because he realized in this war they were going to be going into a meat grinder, which they were. So before they went into action in France, he had them one day running over hill and dale and under barbed wire and obstacle courses and whatever. Finally, they all collapsed in front of him. His battalion did. And he stood up there and said, you know, what the heck's the matter with you? I'm 35 years old carrying the same pack that you are. You don't see me out of breath. From somewhere in the back, a soldier shouted out. He never figured out who it was. But we're not as wild as you are, Bill. Okay? From that day on, Wild Bill Donovan stuck. He claimed he didn't like that nickname because it ran counter to the cool, calm, collected spy image he wanted to project. But his wife, Ruth, said he really did like being called Wild Bill. He returned to New York, a hero, eventually became an assistant attorney general in the Coolidge administration during the Roaring '20s. His goal at that point was to be Attorney General of the United States. And he thought Herbert Hoover, who succeeded Coolidge, had made that promise to him. And in fact, Hoover had. But the Ku Klux Klan, which is a very powerful political movement then, was up in arms over the idea of an Irish Catholic becoming Attorney General of the United States. Donovan, who was a prominent Republican, made his share of enemies in Washington, and Senate Democrats vowed to block his nomination. So Hoover reneged on the promise. Until the day he died, Wild Bill Donovan never forgave Herbert Hoover for backing out on the attorney generalship. He returned to New York City, set up a very prominent law firm there, the Donovan Leisure Law Firm, made millions as a Wall Street lawyer. Then in 1932, he ran for governor of New York on the Republican ticket. His goal then was to be the nation's first Irish Catholic president, and New York was the ideal stepping stone for achieving that. Franklin Roosevelt, 1932, was running for his first term as president. Donovan ended up running as much against Roosevelt as he did against Lieutenant Governor Herbert Lehman, Roosevelt's lieutenant governor, who was running for governor. Said some pretty nasty things about Roosevelt on the campaign trail. At one point, he accused FDR of being, quote, crafty. Okay, back then that was fighting words. It's kind of mild today. Another time, he accused Roosevelt of being a, quote, Hyde Park faker, because Roosevelt on the campaign trail claimed that he was just a simple farmer from Hyde Park, and Donovan said that was a bunch of bunk. Roosevelt, for his part, took his shots at Donovan, had surrogates do it. In fact, Eleanor got on the campaign trail and started criticizing him during the election. Donovan lost that election. Turned out he was a horrible campaigner. If he was here talking to you in a small group, he could turn on that Irish charm and he would have you totally wrapped into what he was saying. Before a large group, though, he was a wooden stick figure, just terrible as a campaigner. In fact, his lieutenant governor, a guy named Truby Davison, thought that Donovan should be running for lieutenant governor and he should be running for governor because he was so lousy on the stump. The reason I mention all this kind of by background is it's amazing that Roosevelt made Donovan his top spymaster in his administration, considering all the nasty things these two guys had said about each other in New York. But fast forward to 1940-41. Roosevelt's building the country up, building the defenses up, preparing the nation for war. Donovan, even though he's a conservative Republican, he thought the New Deal was a communist plot to take over America. Nevertheless, he was a member of the internationalist wing of the Republican Party. He too believed that the nation needed to build itself up for war and the country needed to prepare for this down the road. In the summer of 1940, Roosevelt sends Donovan on an informal diplomatic mission to England to answer really just one question: can Britain survive the war? Donovan is given access to the highest levels of the British government, to naval intelligence, military intelligence over there, MI5, MI6, and all the war agencies. He comes back with bags full of documents, classified documents from Great Britain, and with an answer to the question that yes, Britain could survive the war, but it would need a considerable amount of US aid to do so. As we all know, that came eventually in the form of Lend-Lease. Roosevelt sends Donovan on a second trip at the end of 1940 that lasts through the beginning of 1941. This time he went not only to England, but he went through the Balkans, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. His mission then was not only to collect intelligence about what was going on in that region, but also to deliver a very private message from Franklin Roosevelt to the Balkan and Middle East leaders, which was that Roosevelt did not intend to let Great Britain lose this war. So if you're deciding at this point which side you're going to be on, and a lot of the Balkan leaders were at this point, just keep in mind that the Allies are going to be the winning side. Churchill was delighted with this mission. He cabled Roosevelt that Donovan had been a heartwarming flame on it. Churchill supplied him a British plane to fly him around the region, and he had British military escorts with him to open doors for him and also keep an eye on what he was doing and report back to London. One of his escorts was Ian Fleming, you know, the novelist, wrote the James Bond novels. The State Department, however, wasn't too pleased with this mission, because here you had an American citizen who had no diplomatic standing in the American government or the British government strong-arming Balkan leaders behind closed doors. In fact, the State Department at one point investigated whether Donovan should be prosecuted for violating the Logan Act, which makes it a crime for a U.S. citizen a private citizen to negotiate on behalf of the U.S. government. Roosevelt, however, was only too happy to have Donovan out there freelancing, because keep in mind, in 1940, even going into 41, Roosevelt has no foreign intelligence service in his government to speak of. You have the Army and the Navy had small foreign intelligence units, but they were largely dumping grounds for poor performing officers. Roosevelt's making major foreign policy decisions overseas, whether, you know, how much and how to get Lend-Lease aid to Great Britain, how to circumvent congressional controls. He's running against Wendell Willkie for an unprecedented third term. He's really worried he's going to lose that election to Willkie, and he's making all these decisions overseas largely blind to what lay ahead of him. It worried him so much that sometimes he became physically ill. When Donovan came back from the European missions, that's when our spy story begins. In July 1941, this is before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signs an executive order designating Donovan his coordinator of information. About a year later, it would be called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, but in the beginning, it was the coordinator of information. It was just a one-page document, very vaguely written. It said, Colonel Donovan, which had been his World War I rank, will collect information of national importance for me and do other unspecified things. In fact, the document was so vague that the other cabinet members in Roosevelt's administration began scratching their heads and wondering, what in the world is Franklin up to, appointing this Republican Wall Street lawyer to do all these unusual covert things in his administration. Donovan liked to say that he began his spy agency, the OSS, really from -0, which is really the case. It was really just one guy, and that was Wild Bill Donovan. In the beginning, he was kind of like a player in a pickup basketball game, looking for agents and operations anywhere he could find it. So, for example, the Philips Lamp Company, okay, they made and sold lamps overseas. They may still be in business today, for all I know. Donovan arranged privately with the Philips Lamp Company to have its salesmen, when they went on sales calls overseas, to report back to him, particularly in Axis-occupied countries, what they saw and what they heard. The Eastman Kodak Company, in my day, you know, they made the Brownie cameras. I think they make the disposable cameras today. Back then, they had thousands of camera clubs around the United States. Donovan arranged for the camera clubs to send him the photos that tourists had taken of militarily important sites around the world. Another project he hatched was Project Cigar. Okay, Pan American Airways, we've probably all flown on Pan Am. There's now a new TV series about Pan Am stewardesses or whatever. Back then, Project Cigar, Donovan arranged privately that the ticket agents for Pan Am in Africa would report to him on the movements of Nazis throughout the continent, so he could keep track of Axis agents in Africa. He cooked up all kinds of wild schemes. He was open to practically any crazy idea, or at least willing to consider it. His code number, which you see on the secret OSS documents, was always 109, which just happened to be the room number of his office in the Kremlin. His secretaries had another code name for him. They used to call him Seabiscuit, because like the racehorse, he was always kind of running around all the time. He was always a constant blur to him. He kept $2,000 in his desk drawer at all times to pay off for sources or information when he went prowling around Washington. I don't think you'll find a CIA director that keeps $2,000 in his office now, you know, in petty cash. He had a research and development chief, a guy named Stanley Lovell, who invented all the spy gadgets for him. Donovan used to call him his Professor Moriarty after the Sherlock Holmes character. Stanley Lovell made things like, you know, the miniature cameras that spies have to use, pistols with silencers, incendiary devices, pencil-like incendiary devices used as explosives. Donovan was very, very interested, for example, in truth drugs, fascinated by the use of truth drugs in interrogation. So he had, or Stanley Lovell had one of his officers test out the truth drug on a New York mobster, a guy named Little Augie. Okay? This was a New York City cop who worked for the OSS. He had Little Augie up to his apartment for some smokes and a chat one day. And Little Augie starts puffing away on the cigarette, which is laced with the truth drugs, puffing away, slowly gets kind of a silly grin on his face, starts telling the officer about all the mob hits he's carried out, his working for Lucky Luciano, and all the congressmen he's bribed. Of course, Little Augie's secrets were safe with Donovan. He could never bring him to court or would expose the truth drug they were testing. Other ideas he had. One time he proposed to Franklin Roosevelt that he have a button at his desk that he could push at any time, and it would put him in instant communication with every radio in America. So he could warn people in Los Angeles that the Japanese are attacking, or people in New York that the Germans were attacking on that side. Roosevelt ignored that idea, but Roosevelt was open to every one of Donovan's ideas. Roosevelt actually was a spy buff himself. He liked intrigue. He liked the whole idea of espionage. So for example, one time Donovan's men, Stanley Lovell, tested the idea of fitting bats, you know, the bats that fly on the eaves of houses. They were going to tie incendiary devices around the bats, okay? And the idea was that you would fly over Japan, drop the bats out. The bats would fly into the paper and eaves houses, or paper and wood houses, and the incendiary devices would set off, and it would burn down Japanese cities, okay? I'm not making this up. This really happened. Terrific idea. Eleanor Roosevelt had heard about it. Someone had written her. She passed it on to Franklin. Franklin thought it was kind of cool and gave it to Donovan, and he had Stanley Lovell check it out. So they got a plane, loaded up with a bunch of bats with the incendiary devices tied around them, flew over somewhere in the Midwest, some desert area, dropped out the bats. Guess what happened to the bats? Well, they all sank like stones, yeah. The idea didn't work. But Donovan was willing to try it. He was willing to try other things. One other PSYOP scheme that he had was that Stanley Lovell had concocted some female hormones, okay? If they could find Hitler's vegetables, they would inject the hormones in the vegetables, and it would make his mustache fall out and give him a falsetto voice, which would be a real bummer for the Fuhrer. Eventually, Donovan built his spy organization into over 10,000 covert operatives, espionage agents, commandos, research analysts, support personnel scattered in stations all over the world. Again, a remarkable achievement considering he only started out with one guy, which was Wild Bill Donovan. They mounted covert operations in North Africa during the Torch campaign in November 1942. They had extensive operations in Sicily and Italy. In the Balkans, they aided the guerrillas in Yugoslavia and Greece with very wide-ranging operations there. In Asia, they were really limited to Burma and China, those two theaters. Interestingly enough, MacArthur, commander of the Southwest Pacific Theater, didn't want to have any part of Donovan's force. In fact, banned him from his theater. Didn't think he'd have any use for him. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Northern Pacific Forces, also didn't think much of Donovan's force and wouldn't let him in there. His most extensive operations came in France, northern France and southern France. They mounted, or they had a good bit of research into targets in France and Germany that Hap Arnold's Air Force really appreciated. They also infiltrated in, parachuted in Commandos during that operation. Donovan also liked to go in on landings, the beach landings. He went in on the landings in Sicily and Italy, and it really started to worry his own staff because they thought a spy chief, an intelligence chief, with all those secrets in his head, the last place you want him is at the front where he might be captured and he might be a valuable target. George Marshall, the chief of staff of the Army, thought he had Donovan banned from going in on the Normandy landing. So did Dwight Eisenhower. They thought they had him prohibited and he was going to stay in England. Donovan managed to talk his way aboard a heavy cruiser and land the second day of the Utah beach landing. Had a great time. He was on the beach on a Jeep. German Messerschmitt flies over and strafes the beach, and he goes diving into the sand. He then marches inland about 5 miles with an aide, gets pinned down by a German machine gun nest, reaches into the pocket of his field jacket to look for his suicide pill, because all OSS officers carried a suicide pill, including Donovan, realized he had left it at Claridge's Hotel in London, and was all worried, had an aide radio back to Claridge's because he feared that a maid might come in and mistake it for an aspirin. It took almost 2 years for Donovan to build up his spy organization, which may seem like a long time during the war, but it took the U.S. Army quite a while to build up its force to become a credible force in the war. But eventually it became very, very proficient and turned in a lot of good intelligence. Like all intelligence agencies, it did suffer from its failures too. One of the most striking failures was the vessel case. Donovan thought he had a silver bullet agent planted inside the Vatican, the code name, whose code name was Vessel, who was supplying him with papal transcripts of conversations, private conversations that Pope Pius was having with foreign leaders, Japanese envoys, and with his own envoys on peace initiatives, particularly in Asia. Turned out Vessel was an Italian pornographer with a very vivid imagination who had a talent for writing dialogue, snookered all of Donovan's staff. As I say, this is also a story of political intrigue too. Donovan liked to say that his enemies in Washington were as fierce as Adolf Hitler was in Europe, and that was really the case. He had ferocious fights with J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover thought Donovan's organization was the biggest collection of amateurs he'd ever seen. And actually, in the beginning, it was a big collection of amateurs. Hoover had his FBI spy on Donovan, collected a lot of information on him. They spied on OSS officers. He had moles in Donovan's organization. Donovan spied on Hoover, had moles in Hoover's organization. When I was doing the research for the book, I wondered when did they have time to spy on the Axis? They seemed to be spying on each other so much. The Pentagon, at first, wanted no part of Donovan's Office of Strategic Services. George Marshall thought that this was a plot by Donovan to take over Army and Navy intelligence, which, oh, by the way, is exactly what Donovan had in mind if Franklin Roosevelt would have let him do it. So Marshall eventually comes to accept Donovan's OSS, but his senior intelligence officers never did. And in fact, they fought Donovan's organization throughout the war. At one point, toward the middle of the war, his military intelligence folks even formed their own secret espionage units behind Donovan's back. It was nicknamed the Pond. And its job was not only to spy on the Axis behind Donovan's back, but to spy on Donovan, spy on his officers. They even collected information on the wives of OSS officers. Donovan, in any war, you're going to have generals on the same side fighting among themselves. And World War II was no different from any other war. The British and the Americans, senior officers, there were constant battles among them. In Donovan's case, though, the fights were even more intense because the conventional admirals and generals just really didn't know what this guy was all about. I mean, when he got up there and started talking about propaganda and espionage operations and little Augie and bats fitted with incendiary devices, conventional admirals and generals found that truly disturbing and not really the American way of war. Donovan also brought a lot of the problems on himself by his operating style. He had a habit of never taking no for an answer. So if a commander in front of him said, no, you can't do this, he would make it end run around the commander to his superior officer, try to get the decision to reverse, which of course doesn't win you any friends in the Pentagon. One time he was at a cocktail party in Washington chatting with an admiral, and he had his men burglarize the admiral's office, steal some documents off his desk, and bring the documents to the cocktail party to show the admiral what his agents could do. There's nothing in the record that shows what the admiral's reaction was, but I got a feeling he was probably pretty well nonplussed about it. Donovan also had a penchant for showing up at meetings at the Pentagon, usually late, keeping the other admirals and generals waiting. He was eventually made a major general in the Army. His uniform would always be very carefully tailored at Wetzel's of New York, and he would come into the room with only the Medal of Honor ribbon he had won sewn onto his uniform, as a not so subtle reminder that he had the only medal in the room that actually counted. Eventually, Donovan couldn't overcome his political enemies. Okay? He had drafted a plan for a post-war Central Intelligence Agency, a post-war CIA, and he wanted to lead it after the war. Walter Trohan, who was a reporter for the Washington Times-Herald, which was part of the McCormick-Patterson newspaper chain, which also owned the Chicago Tribune, a Republican newspaper chain, strongly anti-Roosevelt. They despised Roosevelt, and Roosevelt despised the chain. Trohan got leaked to him a copy of Donovan's secret plan to set up a post-war CIA. Most likely, J. Edgar Hoover leaked the document to Trohan, but it could never really be proven. Anyway, he publishes the article in the Washington Times-Herald and the Chicago Tribune, verbatim the secret order that Donovan had drafted, along with a very highly inflammatory story that accused Donovan of wanting to set up an American Gestapo in the United States. Back then, if you accused any organization of being a Gestapo-like organization, you about killed it politically. And it did with Franklin Roosevelt. He basically shelved the plan. Harry Truman comes into office, okay? J. Edgar Hoover has one of his agents plant a particularly nasty rumor with Truman's top military aide that Donovan was having an affair with his daughter-in-law, okay? And they played pretty hardball back then. Now, I had to run that rumor to ground, which wasn't a particularly pleasant chore, but discovered that it wasn't true. Donovan was very close to his daughter-in-law, but only as a daughter-in-law. Even so, Donovan had had a number of affairs over the years. He had a number of mistresses. It was common knowledge in Buffalo, New York. It was common knowledge in Washington among OSS circles, in military intelligence, and it had no problem getting to the FBI and getting passed on to Truman. That wasn't really what sunk Donovan's organization with Harry Truman. What really probably killed it was a 59-page report that the Pond, you remember that's the secret espionage unit, they managed to get to Truman's desk through an Army officer in the White House serving as a conduit. That 59-page report accused Donovan's agency of all manner of misdeed and malfeasance and blown operations and corruption. In fact, at one point, it even accused OSS officers of staging a sex orgy in India, which I found no evidence that was the case. Truman also didn't like Donovan, okay? On the one hand, you had a successful Wall Street Republican lawyer. On the other hand, you had a failed Missouri haberdasher who was a diehard Democrat. There was never going to be good karma between these two guys. So in October 1945, Truman shuts down the OSS. He wasn't naive to the threats that were out there overseas. He knew he was facing an impending Cold War threat, and he needed an intelligence service. He just didn't want Donovan's organization or the OSS having any part of it. Truman in 1947 formed the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, patterned after the vision and the idea that Donovan had. Donovan lobbied through surrogates to try and make himself CIA director, but Truman wasn't going to have any part of that, particularly since Donovan said some nasty things about him on the presidential campaign trail. Dwight Eisenhower comes into office in 1953. Donovan thinks he has his best chance to become CIA director. Ike was a Republican, thought a lot of Donovan's work when he was commander of forces in Europe. Instead, though, Eisenhower makes Allen Dulles CIA director, which deeply disappointed Donovan. He thought Dulles was going to screw up the CIA. Dulles had been his station chief, Donovan's station chief in Bern, Switzerland, done a terrific job. Ironically, Dulles thought Donovan had done a lousy job of running the OSS, and he could have run the agency better. So let me end it there. We can talk about his life afterwards or anything else you'd like to discuss, his legacy and what you see today in the modern CIA.
Yes, my name is Max Gross. I have read quite a few books about the OSS and about Donovan, and one thing I've never understood, and you didn't bring it out yourself,
Right.
There was no Intelligence Oversight Committee. I've never known Congress's role regarding the OSSS. And how did he get paid for?
Good questions. On the first one, whether there was any congressional oversight of his operation, the short answer is no. In fact, at one point, Harry Truman had sent over some requests to get some information about what the OSS was spending its money on. Truman was in charge of that government efficiency committee during the war, and Marshall came to him and talked him out of it, and Truman backed off. Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia at one point tried to find out what the OSS officers were getting paid, and actually they were getting paid pretty high salaries, and he wanted to cut that back. As far as this funding for the OSS, it came initially out of two accounts. Roosevelt in the beginning had a private slush fund, a secret White House fund that was, it was called unvouchered money, which wasn't accountable to Congress, and he could pay out whatever he wanted. So he initially paid Donovan's organization out of the private fund. He also had his own little secret black intelligence unit run by a Washington columnist, a guy named John Franklin Carter, did a little bit of domestic espionage work for him. None of this was really overseen by Congress. Eventually, part of Donovan's funds, as his budget expanded into the hundreds of millions and more, came from appropriated funds from Congress. But even then, Congress really wasn't doing a lot of oversight on what he was doing overseas. He was basically free to operate on his own.
Perfect. I wonder if you could say something about the sources that you used for this book. For example, are all the OSS archives available? Where are they? Do you think they're complete, or do you think that some of it may have been deleted at some point?
Yeah. The good news is that all the OSS documents have been declassified. Practically all of them have been declassified. The bad news is that practically all the OSS documents have been declassified because it runs in the millions and millions of pages. In Donovan's own office, and I had to go through a good bit of that material, in Donovan's own office at the Kremlin, he had something on the order of 170,000 documents there that were under his control, which took me about a year to go through. His personal papers from his law office and other sources, his letters to his family, are at the Army Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in over 360 boxes. I also had to go to the three presidential libraries, the FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower libraries, because a good bit of the OSS information are in those libraries. Then they're scattered in archives and libraries all over the country are different parts of the Donovan story and the OSS story. I also had to go to England to the British archives there because the British spent a good bit of time monitoring Donovan's organization. They were integral to setting up his organization, but they had officers that were spying on Donovan's organization. They knew Donovan was spying on him. So you can go there for the Special Operations Executive papers, which are extensive, some MI6. The Churchill Library had some too. So it took about a little over 2 years to go through and vacuum up everything.
Thank you. Enigma was an enormously successful operation. What I learned is that Donovan had no relationship whatsoever with it. Was he aware of Enigma? Did he have any control whatsoever?
Yeah, actually he did with Enigma. And for Enigma, this was the code-breaking capability the British had for the German military and diplomatic codes. Donovan actually was given access to that code-breaking capability. In fact, he had some of his officers stationed at Bletchley Park where, involved in the code breaking and was given the direct take. Ironically, though, Donovan was not given direct access to MAGIC, which was the Army-Navy code-breaking capability of Japanese military and diplomatic traffic. Marshall didn't trust Donovan's organization, thought he would leak it all out. So throughout the war, he actually had a closer relationship with the British code-breaking capability than he had with his own American code-breaking capability. And he recognized throughout the war that this was really the key intelligence find and had the most value, actually more valuable than his own organization did.
I just finished reading the book last week, and I'd like to say it's one of the best bios I've ever read. It's wonderfully well done. I had two questions.
Sure.
The Donovan Leisure law firm cratered several years ago. I wonder if you could explain to the audience what the relationship was with Mr. Donovan and the law firm, because I know some of his early travels was on behalf of the law firm. And then the second question is, I just finished reading a book about the CIA, and I guess the way I came from the book was this is the gang that couldn't shoot straight. So I wondered how the historical aspect of the OSS would tie into some of the fiascos that the CIA has been involved in.
The Donovan Leisure law firm was formed after Donovan came back from the Coolidge administration in the 20s. He formed it then, really it actually really got going in the middle of the Depression. It was, highly successful. Donovan unfortunately spent a lot of the law firm money along the way. He had no concept for a dollar, and he used a lot of the law firm account to fund his travels overseas. He later was ambassador to Thailand from 1953 to 1954 and traveled around the region on the law firm account. He came back, particularly after World War II, to the law firm, and after his ambassadorship to Thailand, basically broke. And the law firm was not doing well at that point. At that point, he became really a rainmaker for the firm. He was a good arguer before the Supreme Court, but he wasn't really a dry parchment lawyer. And so he was good at drawing in business. As far as the legacy of the OSS, and that carries over to the CIA, the question I get asked is, what difference did the OSS make in the war? Did it win the war for the Allies? And the short answer is no. Did it shorten the war appreciably for the Allies, the OSS? And again, the answer is no, too. But you're setting the bar awfully high when you establish that kind of benchmark, because there were broader factors at work, that were winning the war for the Allies. The fact that we could basically amass more men and machine against the Axis than the Axis could ever field against us. And, as I say, signals intelligence, MAGIC, and Enigma were much more valuable than the OSS was, and Donovan recognized that. One of the values, though, of the OSS, for better or worse, I guess, is that it became the petri dish for the future leaders of the CIA. A lot of future directors, Allen Dulles, Richard Helms, William Colby, Bill Casey, all were officers who served under Donovan, cut their teeth under him, and became future CIA directors. Oh, we don't? Oh, okay. Sorry.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.